Okay, so for this section, we're going to focus a little bit more on sort of two factors. It touches more on that political equality issue. So we start by looking at how it affects, what the effects are like on population and population growth, and if it privileges large or small states. And then we're actually going to move more into an interest group sort of analysis by looking at how it affects minority groups and whether it systematically disenfranchises them or not. So basically what I did for this section is I actually downloaded data from the Census Bureau from 2008 to sort of give a sense of what this would have looked like for the 2008 election, since that was the most recent election. And it will also give us a better idea of how population changes affect electoral college throughout a decade, right? Because the census happens at the beginning of the decade, and those numbers stick for the next 10 years. So they're going to have their largest effect later in the decade as the years go on. But also, we haven't talked very much about how this might affect interest groups throughout the country, and how it might sort of disenfranchise them. So first, I'm going to look at this idea of, are all votes equal? Is it truly one person, one vote? And what we find is that it is not one person, one vote. That the Electoral College systematically distorts the number of voters per Electoral College vote. So what does that mean? It just means how many people what is the ratio between person to Electoral College vote? So we find, once again, that the one person, one vote rule is not upheld. Voters in some states are more influential and they have more weight in their votes than other states. So to give an example, so the highest ratio was in New York, almost 700,000 people per Electoral College vote. So then to give you an idea of where New Mexico fits, it was about 400,000 people per Electoral College vote. And then in Wyoming, it was only 200,000 people per Electoral College vote. So you can see that a Wyoming vote has about 4 times the weight of a New York vote. And a Wyoming vote has over 2 times the weight of a New Mexico vote. So even though we tend to think of ourselves as a smaller state, a battleground state, as being good for us, we still have a disadvantage here, right? Because in places like Wyoming and in very low population states, the actual number of voters per Electoral College vote is much, much lower. And then you can actually see, this is a map, so you can see the hatch marks. The hatch marks indicate, and for the darker states, those are all hatched out. For the largest population states, they all have a disadvantage. So the hatch marks indicate that you're a slightly disadvantaged state or a highly disadvantaged state. And basically this has to do with population. So all of our population centers are disadvantaged under the current systems. And even these middle categories, so not even what we would think of as very large states, are disadvantaged. And the numbers indicate person per Electoral College vote. Okay. And actually, so New Mexico, we are actually, we fall at the very high end of the low categories. So even for us, we start to approach being disadvantaged from a population standpoint. And then this continues with population change. So it's not just, are you a big state, but it's, are you a growing state? So I looked at data from growth between 2000 and 2008, and states that are growing are disadvantaged because Electoral College votes don't change to reflect your changing population. So Nevada had the highest rate of growth between this time period, so they were the most systematically disadvantaged. But New Mexico is actually considered a high growth state. And if you look at the rankings for 2008, I think we are the 15th fastest growing state. We were the 15th fastest growing state in 2008. So we're a high growth state. The number of Electoral College votes we have was not changed to reflect the growth that we have. And also because we have a smaller population, we're still not reaching those thresholds needed to get another Electoral College vote. So we're growing and we're getting bigger, but that's not being reflected in the institution. So you can see the lowest growth state was Michigan, which basically didn't grow at all, but got to keep the same number of votes. And then this would be a map of what that looks like. So this shows you what the growth rates are like across the country. And all of those, it looks red on the computer, but in the slides it looks a little blacker. All of those blacker states are very high growth states. And they are systematically, their number of Electoral College votes is systematically underrepresented and undercounted. So those states that are white and blue are the best states because they're not really changing, but their Electoral College votes still represent this larger population. So once again, population growth exacerbates this distorted ratio. So we have another map that shows the relationship between having a large population and a large growth. yet no electoral college change. So the hatch marks are indicating the states that have a high proportion of population DC vote in relation to the population changes. So we can see that this is all further distorting the relationship between population and the size of the population growth, and the actual number of electoral college votes you get. So we talked a little bit about how this creates political inequalities in terms of one person, one vote, and issues like that. And does the larger amount of popular interest get represented? But in reality, as an institution, it's just not mapping the demographics, right? So our demographics change, our populations are changing, and electoral college is static because of the way that the census works. And then we also wanted to show maps of what the blackout states look like. And to be honest, when I was working on this data, I was just shocked.
Yeah. Sorry, but when you talk about being static, when the census data change, don't the number of representatives change, and doesn't the electoral college reflect that?
The electoral college reflects that.
So it's not entirely static.
Maybe
stagnant is the word.
It's stagnant. I mean, for a 10-year period, demographics change and those institutions don't change. So it's not just electoral colleges, other democratic institutions as well. But I mean, I would say certainly because this is the only one that's really supposed to represent the whole population, where the population is probably matters a little bit more. But so going to where the blackout states are, I was kind of shocked when I just saw how many states this really was, how few states are truly competitive. So the criteria that I used were, there was no campaign event in 2008, which we've talked about. It's a state that is considered safe for 2012, so I went through most of the major news sources and saw how they began to classify states and tried to find a consensus there. That it's been a blackout state for the past 50-year period, or that basically for the past century and a half, it's been a blackout state for at least 100 of those years. So to give you an idea of what those 100-year period blackout states are, there's states like Connecticut or Georgia that are pretty much uniformly one-party states and they have been uniformly blackout. So blackout status changes and competitive status changes, but there are some states that actually never come into play, that never matter. So you can see from this map that this is the relationship between population and blackout status, but if you can see those hatch marks, every state with a hatch mark falls into this blackout category. And we can see that that's the vast majority of the United States. So we see New Mexico and Colorado are not hatched out, so they don't fall into this blackout category. And then you have Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan. You have a very small number of states that basically for the past century have actually mattered and have been competitive in the election cycle. And then going off of that, it was a question of, do small states matter? So I classified the states into three categories, the bottom third, the middle third, and the upper third. And you can see that pretty much all of the bottom third are blacked out, right? Almost uniformly. I think it was, and I have this on the other slide, 30 states. There are 30 states with less than about 5 million people. So of those 30, 23 are blackout states. Only 7 are not. So 80% of the smallest states are blackout states, which to me very strongly indicates that the Electoral College is not privileging small states. Small states are actually kind of getting screwed by the Electoral College. And the only non-blackout status states are Maine, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Nevada, Iowa, California, and Minnesota. So once again, it's a very, very small percentage of small states that matter under the current system. And then looking at this further, what does it look like for the absolute smallest states? So in the United States, we have 8 states that have less than 1 million people. Montana, Delaware, the Dakotas, Alaska, Vermont, DC, and Wyoming. So every single one of the smallest states is a blackout state. So every single one of those states is blackout. So once again, I mean, we see this argument in the news popping up, and I actually saw something published by Ron Paul just a couple years ago about how the Electoral College is good for small states. And when you look at the demographics, it's just not true. This is a myth. The Electoral College does not benefit small states. It benefits competitive states, which is what we talked about previously. And then we wanted to look at if the Electoral College causes racial or ethnic disparities. So how does it affect African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos? And does it discriminate against interest groups or minority groups that are not concentrated in these competitive states. And we find that the Electoral College has a very strong disproportionate effect on minorities because they are geographically concentrated in blackout states. So the first one is the African American population, the relationship between blackout status and African American population. And you can see that pretty much, except for the Carolinas, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, everywhere that blacks live are blacked out. And I'll show you a subset analysis that'll be hopefully a little more clear. So looking at the statistics, there are 18 states with over 1 million African Americans. Only 5 of those states are not blacked out, right? So over 70% of the most populous states for African Americans are blacked out. In the top half, only 2 of those states actually matter. So, and then if you look at the entire country, over 60% of the African American population lives in a blackout state. So only 38% of African Americans live in a place that's in play. And then this map shows that a little better. So everything that's purple is the over 1 million African Americans, and once again, the only places not blacked out are Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and the 2 Carolinas. So you also have to think about not just, you have to think, do those states that matter, do they truly represent the African American population, right? So do the Carolinas speak for all African Americans? Do Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida, do they speak for all African Americans, or is this a community that is different across the United States and might have different interests in different locales that are not being captured because of what the Electoral College looks like? So for Latinos, we see a very similar effect. Actually, Latinos actually tend to live in places that are even worse off. So looking at this slide, there are 7 states with over 1 million Latinos. Texas and California clearly have very, very large Hispanic populations with almost 9 million and 13.5 million. Both Texas and California are blackout states. Just those 2 states being blacked out, that means that almost 50% of the entire Latino population is blacked out. So just the fact that California and Texas are non-competitive means that half of Latinos live in a place that is non-competitive. So we can see there, almost 80% of the entire Latino population lives in a blackout state. That's huge. And also, so in talking about where Latinos matter, we'll see from this next slide that it's pretty much Florida. So of the 7 most populous states, Florida is the only state that matters. And what that really means for the diversity of the Latino community is that Latino interests are really only being represented by Cuban Americans, right? So that this, the diversity of the Latino community is not captured. So once again, in this case, Cuban Americans speak for all Latinos, right? Which certainly, I think, undercuts the diversity of the Latino community. And the fact that Florida, California, and Texas aren't competitive really has some strong negative effects. And we see a very similar effect for Native Americans. So obviously the Native American population is a bit smaller. So when I looked at the numbers for Native Americans, I used 100,000 cutoff. So there are 9 states with over 100,000 Native Americans. 7 of them are blackout status, so that's about 80% of the states with large Native populations are blacked out. The only states with large large Native American populations that aren't blacked out are New Mexico and North Carolina. So I want to make this note about New Mexico, which is, first, really, aside from Florida, we have to represent all the minorities. Florida and New Mexico are where minorities are concentrated in competitive states. So we really have to make this assumption that the communities that are present in those 2 states represent the whole community, which I think probably is not accurate. Is probably certainly not an accurate reflection. So these 7 states represent over half of the Native Americans in the United States. And then once again, over 70% of the entire Native population lives in a blackout state. And then you can look at this is the state that shows the most populous, so South Carolina and New Mexico are the only ones that aren't blacked out. So just kind of in summary, it's about 70% for African Americans and Native Americans, and it's almost 80% for Latinos. So we had sort of said, like, well, Latinos are geographically concentrated, maybe that's better for them, and we find that's not true. They're concentrated in places that just are systematically not competitive in elections. So in general, we find that the Electoral College systematically disenfranchises minority communities. And you can take this further, look at other interest groups that you're interested in. If there's a concentration of religious groups in a certain place, there's a chance that they might be systematically disenfranchised. If there's some sort of political issue that certain groups are mobilized around and they're concentrated in places that don't matter, then those opinions are very unlikely to become important in the election cycle. So, are there any questions on that data? The maps?
Okay, so we've sort of talked about this, and I want to make sure we get to our report, so I don't want to belabor anything. But it is important to come back to this notion that we're a federal system, and power is shared between the federal government and the state government. Though, of course, it's a federal system, so I mean, it is tilted towards the federal government and the Constitution based upon the supremacy clause. So the Founding Fathers built a republic that was based on popular consent and some popular participation, though not a lot. Just at the district level for the House of Representatives. But they wanted to limit that, right? They wanted to limit the power of the people. That's a huge purpose of our design because they were worried about majority tyranny, right? Tyranny of the majority is a huge concern when you review the Federalist Papers and papers on the founding, and particularly the Constitution. So they're worried about unbridled democracy and passions of the people, and so they create a system of government that is checks and balances, right? And that has all of these processes in it to protect really the minority from the majority. And so each branch of government in our system exercises a check upon the actions of the others. Why? To defend itself against tyrannies, right? So we create a system of government that divides power vertically and divides government power vertically and separation of powers horizontally. So horizontally, we have the national government, and we divide powers between our Congress, our executive branch, and our federal courts, and then dividing power with the state government. Of course, then you have state legislatures, state executive branch headed by a governor, and you have state courts. So we have that process set up. And we prevent majority rule, right, by taking our institutions and giving them different, in part, giving them different constituencies and different powers and different terms of office to protect them from the passions of the people, right? So our House of Representatives, its constituency is district within a state. It's done electorally. Their term is every 2 years, so that they have to go back to the people. That's what we're worried about, right? The Founding Fathers were very concerned about the potential passions that might happen in the House, and they have a really large membership. The Senate represents the state, right? Not a district, so they represent a different constituency, so they have different interests. You know, the idea, if you read Federalist 1051, the idea here is that you aggregate interests differently. You want to make sure interests are competing with each other so no majority interest actually materializes. And so you have a Senate that is electorally based now. It's federal, right? Why is it federal? Because it's state-based. They rotate the offices so that there's always a majority in there who weren't elected on whatever the passion of the moment is for that particular year. And there's 102 representing each state. You have one president who represents the nation. His constituency, in essence, is all of the states, right? All of the people in all of the states. It's electoral in the Electoral College, and it's both proportional plus federal, right? Because it takes into account the population and the state. Every state gets 2 votes. So Wyoming, that's why Wyoming has per Electoral College vote so much power, right? Because it's a smaller state, but they still get 2 Electoral College votes because of their because of the Senate. Okay, so there's only one of them, and then we have our Supreme Court, and we appoint them. They're not elected, so they're not beholden to the people at all. We give them a lifetime appointment at the federal level so that they can interpret law and not have to be concerned about the passions or what's happening sort of politically, and there's only 9 of them. Okay, so that's our federal structure. So then our question is, you know, do we want to change, or do we want to consider at all what the impact of changing the system would be on New Mexico and federally in terms of moving to a national popular vote? it seems to me that there is representation here for the state. If we take and change to a national popular vote, either by constitutional amendment or by the compact, if we do that, right, if we do that either way, it doesn't really matter, we still have federalism, right? We're not destroying federalism, it seems to me, at least, if we were to change this office, because we still have huge amounts of federal power in our other branches of government. So I think that's, that's something to think about at least. Where do we want federalism to take place? I mean, we may not want it to happen at that level of people, but there is no one representing the people. So the question is, for us, how do we come up with things that we agree on or agree to disagree on as part of this process? And so I've come up with a bunch of them, but I want to add one. I want to add several, possibly, the things that you guys would want to add to this. One of them I want to include in the report is Paul's point that, moving to a national popular vote in New Mexico may reduce the amount of resources that they get from the National Party. That seems like something that we should include in that that's come up. So it seemed like I wanted to start with one that I think we all agreed on, because I thought that was important that we all agree. And maybe we don't agree, but at least in previous meetings, it seemed to me that we did agree that it's constitutional for states to consider the National Popular Vote Plan, that they can. The states have the constitutional right to award their electoral college votes as they choose. Yes?
I agree with the second statement, but not necessarily the first.
Okay, how are they different?
So I'm not so sure the National Popular Vote Plan is constitutional, as being perhaps a political compact. It has to go through Congress. Now the second part, they have the constitutional right to award it as they see fit. I'm not sure that the National Popular Vote Plan is constitutional at the end of the day.
Can I dissect what you just said?
And
To make sure
go
I
ahead,
understand.
and you're not going to change my mind.
No,
I may be in error, but I know I'm not in doubt.
I just want to understand what you're saying. When I see that sentence, it's constitutional for states to consider the National Popular Vote Plan. The way I'm reading that is sort of in two different ways. The first part of it is, are compacts among states constitutional under the U.S. Constitution?
And the answer to that is generally yes.
Okay, so then the other part of that is it constitutional for the states to change or amend the way they award their electoral college votes?
Individually, yes.
Okay, so the only thing where I heard you were not a definitive yes was compacts are constitutional as long as there's congressional approval.
Well,
Right?
the ones that so affect our political system, my understanding is those have to get run through Congress and go through a different process than what we're considering here. So, I mean, if you start from the premise that it is constitutional, well, I don't agree with that premise. I think that's very much in doubt as to whether a political type compact like this is constitutional amongst the states without congressional approval.
Okay, so if congressional approval was obtained, then it would be constitutional.
I think so. But that would be, I mean, that's tricky to get congressional approval. I think they've tried.
I just wanted to make sure I understood what the issues were.
You know, for driver's licenses, you get a speeding ticket, no problem. I think they can all sort of agree on that. But those points that I get in Kansas, they're going to follow me.
That's state
Yeah, they're going to follow me here.
Is that Commerce Clause? What
Yeah,
is
I don't know
that?
what that is, but I think on something like this is a little more fundamental politically, going to the heart of the way we elect the president.
So could that first sentence be modified?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too.
You know,
is
it's
there something
always
for us-
constitutional to consider.
That's what I wanted to
But
bring that up.
I mean, I would say it may be appropriate for states to consider the national popular vote. I mean, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's constitutional at the end of the day to enter into such a compact. I don't agree with
Let me
that
ask you
statement.
this: would it framing the question slightly differently by saying there is no constitutional obstacle for states to adopt.
That's not, well, there is an obstacle, which is congressional approval.
Let me finish my sentence though, because I was going to include that as the, so long as there's congressional approval. So, there's
But
no.
that's the, I mean, to play the devil's advocate, that's sort of the kiss of, if you're trying to get this approved by our legislature, that may be the kiss of death. When you put on there, you have to get congressional approval, like, well, I'm not touching this thing, because I have to get congressional approval. I mean, it's sort of a vote.
But that's gonna be a Supreme Court thing, right? I mean, that's gonna be someone's gonna test it if
Well-
it were to go through, right?
Well, not the way I understood Jim put it.
Okay.
I agree with Paul. I mean, just the sentence implies that we have determined amongst ourselves that whatever plan is adopted is constitutional, and I don't think that's our position,
I
Well,
suffer,
it's for us to consider it, not, yeah,
I suffer
think it's
from
a-
the handicap that I'm a lawyer, so
Yeah.
all my common sense has been thrown out when I show up here. So
That's okay.
with whatever document we craft here, if it's going to the decision makers, some who are lawyers and some who are not, I feel duty bound to make sure that I use the best language that's possible. And this seems to push it towards saying that it's constitutional when in fact it may not be.
Let me address something. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
One of the things that we're trying to focus, or how do I want to phrase this? We want to get to a point where we can talk about in the report a lot of the issues that have come up amongst this group. And it seems that there doesn't seem to be a lot of dispute or disagreement that going in this direction is constitutional. I'm using this in a limiting way. And so what we're trying to do is come up with some sort of a set of phrases here where we can say, okay, look, we're not going to argue about constitutionality because under the right circumstances, this process would be constitutional. There's not, but there are so many other issues that people do have, whether it's disagreement or discussion or unintended consequence issues, those sorts of things, that those are the kinds of things we want to try to address and really talk about in the report. And so if we can get past this issue, which maybe we're not going to be able to, but if we can agree on some way to characterize this, then we can talk about all these other issues.
If the plan doesn't contemplate a compact that's political in nature that requires congressional approval, then I can't sign on to that first.
What if it was changed and you took consider a national popular vote plan?
Or why can't you just say it's appropriate for states to consider the national vote plan because you're putting underneath it that you have the constitutional right to do that?
You can
Yeah.
Well, but
consider.
considering something is not a constitutional issue, we can consider all sorts of things that if they're actually in place would be
I mean,
unconstitutional.
there's
What if we
nothing
said states have the constitutional right to award their electoral college votes as they choose, including the national popular vote plan?
I don't
Let's
know.
go.
The problem, I mean, it assumes the premise.
I mean, we can debate about whether we think this is constitutional or not all we want. I think that Jim gave a really thorough presentation in the last one about the precedents for doing this sort of thing, that sort of, this is the information that every other state that's adopted this plan is based on. And so when we say we're not the Supreme Court here, and ultimately it would be up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not this is constitutional, should it pass, but we're going to proceed,
As if.
the full faith, in good faith that this is a constitutionally, sound process. I mean, can we just agree to that?
I can't agree with that, because I don't start from the premise that it's constitutional to do this, the way that it's conceived of. Now, if you run it through the political compact, analysis, and you have to get congressional approval and all of that, I might be able to live with that framing of it, but my understanding is this particular plan doesn't want to go that route. I mean, they want to do it without congressional approval and treat it more like, I mentioned the driver's license complex, more like that than having to deal with Congress on the issue. So, I mean, there's,
What statement would you be happy with? So what's,
I like-
let's get your,
I like number two.
but,
I mean, there's nothing wrong with it.
but it doesn't, yeah, I mean, including the national popular vote plan.
Well, I
But
don't
we
think-
have the right to consider it, they have the right to tell us we're wrong.
Always have the right, I don't come from that, I like governments to not rely on the courts necessarily telling them what to do, but that's a whole other issue, but, I just can't sign on to the first sentence. I mean, I can't get around, I mean, to me, when you say something is constitutional, it means it's okay, that it's good, and we don't know the answer to that question, because it's not tested by the Supreme Court, if that's where you're going to go.
Do we have the right to move forward and consider policy that may not be?
Well, sure,
Okay.
you can, but I don't come, I mean, that's not necessarily where I come from, but that, you can always do it, doesn't make it right, but, so anyway.
Lynn?
Well, if you have the right to award your electrical college votes as you choose, I don't even think you need the first paragraph.
Okay.
And secondly, with all due respect, Paul, I think your position is not legal but political. Because if you'll take it with congressional approval, but you won't take it without congressional approval, that suggests to me something that goes beyond the right of the state to make its own decision.
But that's,
And why would you want to have Congress intrude upon the state's right to do as it chooses?
that's the beauty of federalism. We can't all do everything that we all want to do. And that's where Congress is a check on what states may want to do in an area like this. It's just the system
Congress
that we
has
got.
no authority to intrude upon the state's constitutional right to divide its votes as they choose.
And I just differ with you on
Okay.
that. It doesn't mean you're right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. It's just I have a different policy view of what federalism is. I mean, it's always constitutional to consider something. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not-
that's what-
it's
That's
not
my
like it-
understanding.
It's not like you're being muzzled, you know, you can't even throw it out there for consideration, but, you know, to a layman or a decision maker who hasn't gone through what we've gone through, you know, doesn't know what we know, that to me just seems to push it towards it is constitutional, this particular point.
Can you change the
I'm
word
just not sure at the end
consider?
of the day that it is.
In the
Can
first
you change
sentence,
the word consider to something
should
else?
we substitute the word adopt for the word consider, and then
Oh.
you're talking about something.
That's more,
Much better.
that doesn't help.
No, it doesn't help your issue,
Right.
but I think your issue is more, the constitutionality of compacts
Correct.
that's specific, and as I'm understanding you to say, you're saying that it's not just any compact, it's compacts that are political in nature.
Yes.
And so this, you're considering a compact that is a political compact.
Right.
And so as such, it would require congressional ratification.
Whatever
What's
that-
the term you would use?
It's either approval or ratification, I forget how they phrase
Okay, so in order to come up with a sentence there, it would be, it's constitutional for states to enter into interstate compacts that involve political matters, so political matters, so long as they are congressionally approved or ratified.
And I'm okay with that, but that seems to be, I'm completely okay with that. But again, to play devil's advocate, that's not necessarily what the plan.
All we're trying to do is get past this legal question about getting there and then talk about
I
some
don't
of
want
the
to shortchange everybody else
Well,
who
let me,
doesn't have a
let
problem
me
with
just
the.
make a suggestion. I understand your point, and I understand Paul's point. As a non-attorney, non-academic person, to me, when I read the first sentence, it implies that we've vetted this process, and I think you have made a case for that. I'm just saying that if we could say it's appropriate for states to consider the National Popular Vote Plan, and then right below that, it reiterate that states have the constitutional right to award their electoral votes as they choose. Do we have to say constitutional in both sentences? I mean, do you think it's that important to say it in the first sentence?
It's fine with me. What we're trying to avoid is later on, when we start crafting this report, getting into this discussion.
Well,
Like,
you've said right
we
here.
can't do this because it's unconstitutional.
No, it says states have the constitutional right to award their votes, right?
It's fine with me. Yeah,
And
everyone
it's
else is-
appropriate for them to consider this plan because they have the right to.
Okay.
Beautiful.
I like it.
That work, Paul?
I can live with it.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought that was the softball. Okay, so I thought there were 3 perspectives that we discussed, and so I'm happy to add on more. The perspective of voters, the perspective of interest groups, and the perspective of states. And we can add sentences as we please. And at some point, we may say, we can say, look, you know, there's disagreement among us. Okay, so we can include that. So we don't have to agree, I think, on every point. I think that there can be disagreement on points, and we can say, we were not fully in agreement on this, though a majority agreed, okay? National popular vote represents a method of allocating electoral votes in which all votes are counted equally, one person, one vote.
No comment.
I should have started with this one.
And then you have to go to the next step, which is that, and then a majority or a plurality. Whoever achieves the majority or a plurality is elected president. I don't know, maybe that's not, maybe that's.
That may come up in another sentence.
I'm not sure. Let's come back to it. And this may disagree on. Popular vote encourages participation from all voters because their vote matters to outcomes, no matter their state characteristics. To the outcome, this is poorly worded, I apologize. To the outcome, no matter their state characteristics, i.e., how close the state is. So maybe we need to say something more about how close the state is, one-party state, or something like that.
Well, and then just going back to what we were talking about earlier, we might want to say national popular vote may encourage participation.
I don't think we should say that at all.
I don't know.
The main part?
I don't know that that's,
That's
I
not
mean, just
true.
knowing what I know about elections, I'm not sure that a national popular vote makes any difference as to turnout or.
You could put at least for one cycle.
Till we learn another one.
Maggie? Maggie, what did you say?
I'm saying that I said that it may, so perhaps that's more appropriate than giving a definitive.
Why don't you say something like, if it's, you know, all your statistics say that the voters favor this, instead of saying it encouraged participation, that,
Really, we hope. I mean, it's
well, maybe
hope
it
that the national popular
conveys
vote
the belief
will
that their
encourage
vote matters,
this.
or
We
it
just don't
conveys,
know. There's
Oh,
no,
I like, yeah.
instead of that encourages participation, because I'm telling you, I just don't believe that that's necessarily true.
I think what this is trying to get at is that question or issue of an apathetic voter in a blackout state, or, and I'm using Kim's term and probably inartfully and without knowing exactly what she was meaning, but in a state that is definitively going to go Democrat, you're going to have Republicans in the presidential, in a presidential election who may not have the kind of incentive or enthusiasm to go cast their vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. At the same time, in that same Republican state, you may have Republicans who are thinking, well, it doesn't really matter whether I go cast my vote, I support the Republican, but if I get to it, great. If I don't, that's fine because the Republican's going to win anyway. So I think the idea here is, does this process alter that potential apathy that exists in states where it's a foregone conclusion how it's going to go? This is a distinction between a battleground state and a non-battleground state.
I just think all the research shows that people are gonna vote or they're not gonna vote. And you can do a variety of things to stimulate that, but it generally doesn't affect the outcome.
So Kim's dad he's an anomaly in Maryland.
No, I respect that opinion. I just say, it's just like I said earlier, I was very surprised that you do all these things to stimulate or facilitate or whatever, and it doesn't affect the outcome.
Right.
And so when you say this, you know, I think if this is your desire to promote national popular vote, and then it doesn't encourage participation, then you're going to have already started at the beginning and failing in your premise.
Right, I mean, our desire is to provide information to elected officials so that they can be knowledgeable about this issue. And so we want to, we're part of their knowledge network, maybe. So,
Well,
what if
say
I,
it may allow certain individuals in the state to be more representative, to be, just, it may give opportunity for individuals in blackout states to have representation.
what if,
And the voice is
I
heard.
like Rhonda, the benefit, what if we added to this as a sub, the benefits of participation may increase because every one vote has equal influence.
I mean, I'm not the final word on it. I just think you're putting forth something that none of the data that I've looked at supports. That all of the election reforms and things that have changed, participation is more affected by issues that affect that person, not about whether their electoral vote counts or not.
It's about their, would you agree that the campaign stimulates people?
Well, yes, but that's because they technically campaign on the issues.
Okay, I mean, maybe we don't want this at all.
I mean,
I'm
that's
not sure
just
I
my
can-
opinion.
It's just it's a conclusion to be drawn after 1, 2, or 3 election cycles with national popular vote. I just don't know enough